Welcome to Audit the Audit, where we sort out the who and what and the right and wrong of police interactions. This episode covers reasonable suspicion, open carrying, and officer conduct, and is brought to us by Brent McCain's channel. Be sure to check out the description below and give them the credit that they deserve. Before we dive into the interaction, I want to give a big thanks to the sponsor of this episode, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of inspiring classes designed for real life and all the circumstances that come with it. With Skillshare, you can learn anything from how to play guitar to how to build a website, and each class is filled with fresh and innovative content that is easy to digest and replicate. Thomas Frank's Productivity Masterclass is a great resource for developing structure in your everyday life, and it helped me develop an efficient workflow for writing and researching. A Skillshare membership is less than $10 a month with an annual subscription, but right now, the first 1,000 people to use the link in my description will get a free trial of Skillshare Premium. You have absolutely nothing to lose, so click on the link in the description to start diversifying your skill set today. Thanks again to Skillshare for sponsoring this episode. On December 4th, 2020, YouTuber and First Amendment auditor Brent McCain was filming the Houston County Justice Center in Crockett, Texas, while standing on the outskirts of the parking lot. Mr. McCain was open carrying a pistol on his hip, and shortly after he started recording, he was confronted by Deputy Cody English and Deputy Rocky Hoach of the Houston County Sheriff's Office, who immediately detained him. After a brief exchange with the deputies, Sergeant Lorenzo Simpson arrived on the scene and took over the detention.
If you have a license to carry, that's fine. But also, when you're on our property,
it's public property.
Have a legitimate complaint, then that kind of puts it suspicious.
May I ask you this? Am I doing anything illegal?
Activity.
Is suspicious activity,
suspicious
is that a felony or a misdemeanor, sir?
To investigate suspicious persons? Actually, it's not an actual offense. It's a complaint and it's an investigation. That's why we say we investigate.
Mr. McCain asked the sergeant if suspicion is a felony or a misdemeanor, but as discussed on many episodes of ATA, officers do not need suspicion of a specific crime in order to effectuate a detainment. The Terry versus Ohio case dictates the legality of many factors of this interaction, and it's worth exploring this case to gain a deeper understanding of how reasonable suspicion works. The Terry case centered around an officer who witnessed 3 men acting suspiciously on a street corner in downtown Cleveland, Ohio. The officers saw the men take turns peeking through a store window, and later testified that he thought the men were casing the store for a potential robbery. The officer stopped the 3 men, identified himself as a member of law enforcement, and conducted an exterior pat-down of each suspect. During the pat-down, the officer felt a bulge in one of the men's pockets, which turned out to be a firearm. The officer seized the weapon and frisked the other 2 men, finding yet another pistol. The 2 men who were in possession of the firearms were charged with, and eventually convicted of, carrying concealed weapons. The arrestees appealed their case all the way to the Supreme Court, arguing that their Fourth Amendment rights had been violated because they were searched without probable cause. The Supreme Court denied the suspect's motion to suppress the firearms as evidence, and went on to draft the standard for reasonable suspicion that we all know today. The court acknowledged that officers should not be reserved to only conducting investigations if they have enough evidence to effectuate an arrest, and also noted that although nothing the suspects did was illegal on its face, when all the facts are taken together, the encounter warranted investigation. The court concluded that, quote, in justifying the particular intrusion, the police officer must be able to point to specific and articulable facts, which, taken together with rational inferences from those facts, reasonably warrant that intrusion. According to the Terry ruling, if an officer witnesses behavior that reasonably leads him to believe that criminal activity is afoot, then he may detain the individual in question to conduct a brief investigation into their conduct. Mr. McCain's assertion that suspicion is not a crime is irrelevant, because the highest court in the land has determined that suspicion of a specific crime is not necessary. We will discuss the legitimacy of Mr. McCain's detainment in a moment, but the point of this section is to highlight the fact that officers can detain citizens purely on the merits of their suspicious behavior, even if that behavior is entirely legal.
And so that's why we ask you for what your name is. And we're not telling you that you can't film. You're right. You got every right in the world to go out and film whatever, as long as you're not violating nobody's rights, you're not creating a disturbance, causing problems and stuff. Hey, that's one thing. But where our issue and our concern and our safety coming in at is because, like I just explained to you, we've had so many complaints and we've had so many threats on our lives. And just like I said, just today, this morning, we've had all those threats on our life, and then all of a sudden we get someone here on the property with a firearm, we don't know, and we come out and we come to talk to you respectfully and ask you who you are. Why are you walking around the property with a firearm? Because honestly, most people that do that, they're either police or they're special investigators, or they actually have a license to carry. Now, if you'll notice, those guards over there, it's illegal to carry a firearm on this property, license or not.
On the property?
Yes, sir. Unless you actually are a peace officer.
Yeah, in the parking lot, it's illegal.
It is illegal.
I don't think so.
Well, you don't have to think so. I'm telling you so.
Sergeant Lorenzo tells Mr. McCain that it is illegal to possess a firearm anywhere on the Justice Center's property. Mr. McCain politely disagrees. Texas has several laws which regulate carrying firearms, and the restrictions associated with open carrying depend on several factors, such as the manner in which the firearm is carried and the location where the firearm is displayed. Subsection 2A of Texas Penal Code 46.02 states that a person commits an offense if the person intentionally, knowingly, or recklessly carries on or about his or her person a handgun, and is not on the person's own premises or premises under the person's control, or inside of or directly en route to a motor vehicle or watercraft that is owned by the person or under the person's control. This section describes when it is unlawful to carry certain weapons. It contains exceptions relating to handguns in certain motor vehicles and watercraft and under specific circumstances. And subsection B1 of this code provides an exception specifically for citizens who are licensed to carry handguns, which Mr. McCain is. Texas Penal Code 46.03 outlines certain locations where firearms are forbidden altogether. And this code provides that firearms are not allowed on the premises of any government court or offices utilized by the court, or on the premises of a correctional facility. The Houston County Justice Center serves as both a courtroom and a correctional facility. However, as Mr. McCain pointed out to me during our talks, Code 46.03 defers the definition of the word premises to Texas Penal Code 46.035, which defines it as a building or a portion of a building. The code goes on to clarify that the term does not include any public or private driveway, street, sidewalk, walkway, parking lot, parking garage, or other parking area. Although the Justice Center may rightfully ban firearms from entering the building, Texas law is clear that firearms are allowed in the public parking areas of any building. Mr. McCain is well within his rights to carry a firearm in the parking lot of the Justice Center, but that does not mean that it cannot be a contributing factor for reasonable suspicion.
It's posted.
It's posted on the building. It's inside the building.
Well, either way,
it's not on the parking lot.
As I explained to you, it's suspicious activity and we have a right to conduct an investigation and ask you at this time and point who you are, because like I said, each of our lives have been threatened.
Did I threaten your life?
We didn't say you threatened our life.
All right.
Everybody that called us, you think they told us who they are? We don't know who they are, so we don't know if it was you. We don't know if it was somebody else. We have no idea, so that's why at this point we have a right to investigate and find out who you are.
Okay. I'll tell you what. Let me see your ID, I'll show you my ID.
I don't have a problem showing you my ID. See my ID?
Okay. How about your driver's license?
I showed you my ID.
Okay.
So,
all right. So
it's your turn.
Okay. All right. So.
Hey, it's your turn.
The last letter of my first name is T.
Like I just showed you mine. You asked?
I asked for your driver's license.
I comply with your request.
I did say and then I said.
So.
And then
I showed you my ID.
And you agreed.
And you agreed to that. So that tells me that if you're not going to be a man of your word, then we probably don't need to continue to talk. You know who I am.
Okay, I'm going to put this down here, okay?
I don't know. Certainly looks like you. Mr. McCain, right? Where are you from, Mr. McCain?
I don't answer questions.
You don't answer questions?
No, sir.
Do you hang tight just a minute, Mr. McCain, okay? But now I will tell you this. For our safety and your safety, I'm going to remove your weapon from you.
There's absolutely no reason for you to remove my weapon.
Now, like I just told you, for my safety and your safety, I am going to remove your weapon from you.
Oh, we've been talking, we've been speaking.
And I'm just telling you right now. So I'm going to ask you to hold your hand up, okay? To avoid any type of confrontation or conflict. I'm going to remove your weapon safely, and I'm going to actually place it over here until we find out anything different, okay?
Here, Sergeant Simpson informs Mr. McCain that he is going to disarm him for both of their safety. And although Mr. McCain does not agree with the sergeant, he peacefully complies. The legality of the sergeant's decision to disarm Mr. McCain is highly dependent on whether the officers had met the standard of reasonable suspicion discussed earlier in this episode. In the Terry case, the court acknowledged that, quote, when an officer is justified in believing that the individual whose suspicious behavior he is investigating at close range is armed and presently dangerous to the officer or to others, it would appear to be clearly unreasonable to deny the officer the power to take necessary measures to determine whether the person is in fact carrying a weapon and to neutralize the threat of physical harm. As the Chief Justice Earl Warren noted, quote, certainly it would be unreasonable to require that police officers take unnecessary risks in the performance of their duties. American criminals have a long tradition of armed violence. The Terry ruling essentially concluded that if an officer has acquired reasonable suspicion to believe that an individual is engaged in criminal activity, then the officer is within their authority to disarm said individual. As mentioned before, the legality of the sergeant's disarming of Mr. McCain depends upon whether the officers had obtained reasonable suspicion. And the anonymous threats that Sergeant Simpson was referring to earlier in the encounter would certainly play a role in that determination. The court has routinely championed the concept of weighing the totality of circumstances when determining whether reasonable suspicion or probable cause exist. And in the 1983 Supreme Court case of Illinois versus Gates, the court held that probable cause is a fluid concept that is, quote, not readily or even usefully reduced to a neat set of legal rules. Courts have long been charged with considering all of the facts associated with any particular interaction, and balancing an officer's intrusion into the personal liberty of citizens with those citizens' constitutional rights. If the Justice Center had in fact been receiving continuous anonymous threats against the lives of their officers, then it is likely that a court would consider Mr. McCain's detainment and disarming legitimate. After removing Mr. McCain's firearm, Sergeant Simpson returns to his patrol vehicle to verify that Mr. McCain is licensed to carry a handgun. Once the sergeant confirmed that Mr. McCain does have a valid license to carry, he returned Mr. McCain's firearm.
Mr. McCain?
Yes, sir?
I'm going to place your weapon back in your holster. Thank you for your cooperation, sir. You have a good day.
Well, you have a good one, too.
Thank you, sir.
That's okay, thank you.
Right.
After the stop was concluded, Mr. McCain collected the officers' names and badge numbers and was allowed to continue filming without further incident. Following the encounter, Mr. McCain contacted Houston County Sheriff Justin Kiloff via phone to discuss the interaction. The sheriff was cordial, but stood by the actions of his deputies, and their conversation did not result in any disciplinary action. Overall, Sergeant Simpson and the Houston County Sheriff's Office get an A-, because although they misunderstood the authority of Code 46.03, the deputies approached Mr. McCain calmly and peacefully, conducted a legitimate investigation, and ultimately allowed Mr. McCain to go free without arresting or citing him. The exchange of identifying information that took place between Sergeant Simpson and Mr. McCain will likely be a point of contention for many viewers of this episode, but as far as I'm concerned, that agreement was established outside the scope of the legal system, and was more so an impromptu agreement between two individuals. Although the sergeant was acting in his official capacity at the time, he did not force Mr. McCain to honor his side of the agreement, and the pressure for Mr. McCain to adhere to the exchange stemmed from his honor as an individual, not his obligations as a detainee. The acquisition of reasonable suspicion was the crux of this interaction, and if the sergeant's assertions about the threats the department received are true, then there is no doubt that Mr. McCain's detention was legitimate. I have no reason to believe that the sergeant was lying about those threats, but there is no way to independently verify his claims. It is difficult to fault the Houston County deputies for their conduct given the circumstances, and all of the deputies involved were relatively professional throughout the interaction. I commend the Houston County deputies for approaching the situation cautiously and respectfully, and for engaging in a peaceful dialogue with Mr. McCain. As we have seen in many past episodes of ATA, not all officers would have taken the same approach to this encounter, and the Houston County Sheriff's Office deserves recognition for their conduct. Mr. McCain also gets an A-, because although he could have exercised his right to silence more effectively, he remained calm and collected throughout the encounter, engaged in a peaceful and productive dialogue with the deputies, and maintained a respectable balance between complying with the deputies and asserting his constitutional rights. Mr. McCain had no way of knowing about the supposed threats to the department before deciding to carry out this audit, and none of his conduct was illegal by any measure of the law. After speaking to Mr. McCain, it is clear that he is well versed in Texas's open carry laws, and it's safe to say that he did his due diligence before carrying out this audit. Although the cards were circumstantially stacked against him, Mr. McCain managed to bring this audit to a close in his favor, and I do not fault him for upholding his side of the identification exchange with Sergeant Simpson. As mentioned before, the merits of this argument were reached outside the scope of legal obligations, and neither Sergeant Simpson nor Mr. McCain were required to honor that agreement. If this stop were to be challenged, there is a high probability that the court would rule in favor of the officers, and Mr. McCain was right to let this encounter end where it did. I commend Mr. McCain for exercising his rights respectfully and not allowing his emotions to dictate the outcome of this interaction. I highly recommend giving Mr. McCain's channel your support and let him know that I sent you. You can find a link to his channel in the description below. Let us know if there's an interaction or legal topic you would like us to discuss in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more police interaction content.